Matthew chapter 5, looking at the beatitudes. As a reminder, our class is alternating back and forth. On Sundays, we're talking about doubts. The topic of doubt, the effect that doubt has as we see within the Christian community, people that falter and fall away because of the doubts that they have. And that section is focusing on building up, solidifying our foundation so that those doubts don't cause us to crumble, don't cause us to falter, the edifice to fall down. And what we're focused on Wednesdays is discipleship. Doubt and discipleship is the snappy phrase we use for describing this class. It's focused on really building on that foundation. If we can solidify the foundation we have, how do we actively and eagerly build up what it is to be an eager disciple for Christ? And so we've been starting in the Beatitudes, looking at these verse by verse to understand what it looks like to live a life that Christ wants us to live a life that he calls blessed. Matthew chapter 5, starting verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. We want to focus tonight on verse 6. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. A silly question to get started. What is hunger and what is thirst? Just in the basic understandings of the words. Crave. So craving things. For hunger, it's food. For thirst, it's water. It's fluids. It's the desire within us for those things. And specifically, it's not just things that I like. It's things, not specifically things that I find enjoyable. This is for things that are vital for life. It's a natural impulse built within us, designed within us, to spur us to get the things that we must have or we will die. And so I want to talk a little bit about thirst and hunger and make sure we have it, I guess, in the proper perspective, because that word has really a range of meaning. I'm a little hungry because I didn't eat dinner yet, and so I'll get something after this is over. That's hunger. However, there's also people that haven't eaten for 2 weeks. They've had nothing whatsoever to eat. That's hunger too, but it's on a completely different level. It's of a completely different scale. And thirst is similar. You know, I may want to get a cup of water right after this is over just to refresh my tongue, just to keep myself from being a little bit parched. But going days without water, that's what real thirst looks like. That's an extreme version of thirst. I've talked about it before. I think I did a small lesson on it, but I remember having stomach flu one time. And stomach flu is pretty nasty, even though it's short-lived. And the flu itself isn't the bad part. Well, I guess what you're saying then is the disease isn't so bad except for the parts that kill you. But the reason stomach flu is so bad, your body can fight off the infection okay over the course of a couple days, but you can't keep fluids down. You're losing fluid, and the reason you can suffer damage is if you can't replenish those fluids, things that you must have to live, that's what causes you to suffer and potentially die from it. And I remember having stomach flu and truly appreciating what being thirsty meant. Truly understanding thirst, where I could be sitting there just for minutes at a time thinking, I really, really, really want a drink. I need to have a drink. And yet, every time I go to get a drink, I end up losing it, not able to keep it. Me being thirsty on a hot day, it's relevant. It's part of the same impulse, but it wasn't thirst like that. So, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. What does that mean? What is the connection being drawn? And that one's not rhetorical, so I'll wait for an answer. John? You need them? So he's using these words that talk about physical necessity, and he's relating it directly to righteousness. Righteousness is something that we need. It's something that's vital for life. And so, those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, what does that look like? In real life, all of us, we all hunger and thirst for sustenance, for water. I think everybody has those impulses. I don't know if it's possible to lose those impulses. In the spiritual realm, is that the case? Scott?
It's a bit like swimming upstream, because our natural inclination is not righteousness. I mean, I think we're all good people, but we have the sin problem. So hungering and thirsting for righteousness is a swimming upstream sort of concept.
So Scott likens it to swimming upstream, that when it comes to righteousness, that's not the natural inclination people have. We have a tendency towards unrighteousness. We have a tendency towards pride, towards selfishness, towards sin. And so developing a desire for righteousness, a focus on being righteous, that's going against some natural impulses that we have, natural inclinations that we have. Does everybody hunger and thirst after righteousness? No. But we have to think about what that means. Does everybody need righteousness? Yeah. Everybody needs it or else they'll die. Just like everybody needs water. Everybody needs food. Those are things that are vital to your physical life. Righteousness is vital to your spiritual life. But only some people hunger and thirst for it. What does that mean? John? John pointed out two perspectives, I think, to help explain this. One, it's a matter of recognition. We see in the beginning, blessed are the poor in spirit. Well, every human is poor in spirit. Every human is in poverty when it comes to the proper spirit in relation to God. But those that are poor in spirit, that are blessed in this case, are those that recognize it, that have an appreciation for what that poverty means, and thus choose to change the way that they're living in relation to a God who wants to share his riches. Similarly, Those who recognize that they're hungry and thirsty for righteousness, that recognize they don't have it and they need more of it, those are the people who are going to appreciate that and actually pursue it. And he likened it to a football practice long ago where extremely sweaty and hot, then you have this Gatorade solution. Drinking that, he said it was delicious, it was tasty, it was sweet, it was something they earnestly desired in the middle of all of that exertion. But then one time they went to get the same drink when they just were going about their normal day-to-day business. They weren't dehydrated, they weren't tired, and they said they almost spit it out. Like, it wasn't tasty, it wasn't appealing when they didn't have need of those things. The only difference in the analogy is, again, everyone needs it. It's just some people don't recognize their need for it. They don't recognize the signs that they are hungering and thirsting. I saw hands in the middle here. Yes, behind Fred, and then Fred.
One of the things I think that's being referred to here too is the way that hunger and thirst affect our thinking. And so when you're really hungry, you might stop whatever you're in the middle of and get in the car and drive a half hour and go get something to eat. Why? Because your mind you cannot remove your mind off of the focus of the thought that I'm hungry, whatever I have to do has got to wait. You know, there may be people that are sitting at home that'll get in their car and drive 20 minutes to go have that cup of coffee because they're longing for that and they can't do anything else until they satisfy that need. And so if we get to where this affects our attitude and our mind, then our mind will be so focused on obtaining righteousness that we won't be able to think of anything else because we're overpowered by that longing, and it will actually have an impact on our physical actions in our daily life. And so we see it exemplified in physical hunger and thirst, how it affects us. But then now we can see the spiritual application of how we ought to be in the same mode.
So hunger and thirst affect our minds, affect what we're able to focus on. If we feel hunger, if we feel thirst, we're going to be focused on satisfying those needs, on fulfilling them. We need water, we need food. In this case, if we recognize how much we're lacking in righteousness, we know we need it. We need that within us, and so it's going to be our focus. It's going to be our mission to obtain it. Fred?
I think we might be related. Similar thought. So, yeah, just if we're truly hungering and thirsting, nothing's going to get in the way. I mean, we're going to seek it no matter what it takes. And if there's some roadblock, if there's some inconvenience in the way, something that we have to overcome, we're going to find a way. If we're truly hungering and thirsting after this, and unfortunately, that is often, speaking for myself, not necessarily my attitude when it comes to righteousness.
So if it's true, sincere hunger and thirst, we're going to overcome the obstacles that are in our way, or at least we're going to try really hard to overcome them. If I'm dying of thirst, I'm not going to say, well, this door is locked and so I give up. I'm going to figure out a way to try to get past that because you need to have it. I recognize the need that I have. Bill?
A slightly different twist on this, but as one deals with the elderly, there are a lot of them that just don't want to drink. And as they become dehydrated, sometimes they become totally irrational. If we're not longing, thirsting, and hungry after righteousness, you kind of become irrational.
So Bill pointed out that in some cases for the elderly, they stop really having like physical thirst or physical hunger, where their body needs those things, but they don't recognize or feel the need for them, which I guess counters what I said earlier, and I should have remembered it because I've seen those scenarios before, where a person is dehydrated, but they don't feel thirsty. So thirst and hunger are the feelings that motivate satisfying the physical needs. And so if we do tie that into this passage, there are people that everyone, again, has the spiritual need for righteousness. But if you don't recognize that, if you don't recognize that sensation, if you don't recognize the feeling of, oh, I need that, I have to acquire it, that's the same pattern that we talked about. Mark?
Say, in the world around us too, even many of us in our own lives, we can identify some scenarios like this. When we're talking about food, so let's throw in the concept of junk
things that we might pursue, and that especially those that either want to actively deny God or have not recognized God already, that will then attempt to fill that need with something else. They feel the need, they feel the hunger, they feel the lack of something feeding them, and they'll try and fill it with whatever they've decided is a good deed or a good idea or a positive mentality or a positive item or point of view to back up and to try and hold up as good and or righteous. And the same kind of thing happens in society then as happens with our bodies. If you feed yourself on junk food, you'll fill up, but you'll destroy your body in the process.
Mark made an analogy to junk food, where we have hunger, we have thirst, and you can try to satisfy those things with empty, unhealthy things. You can try to fill that void, and it doesn't accomplish what you want it to. It can feel like it's sustaining you, but ultimately it's unhealthy. And you can make a good analogy into spirituality. People have a need, and some people feel the need for there to be more, for there to be a spiritual truth in their lives, but they fill it with falsehoods, with things that seem like they're scratching that itch, but aren't sustaining, that aren't healthy, that aren't life-giving. And ultimately it does the same thing. It leads to unhealthiness and decay. Bill.
Adding on to what Mark said, very close to what I was going to say. Today my lunch consisted of a delicious hot dog and a chocolate ball. And then I crave them really good, but I can't do that every day. And then Peter's exhortation, crave the pure spiritual milk, something that's healthy for my body, so I should eat. Craving for righteousness is salvation for the soul.
Bill pointed out that his lunch today wasn't the healthiest, but it was very tasty. But that's not what he can eat all the time. It can't be the only thing he's subsisting on. And point out we need to focus on the pure, healthy, life-giving things. Dan?
I think there's more to it than just seeking righteousness and wanting righteousness. Because if you think about how many people sort of followed Christ from, walked and followed him to this location to hear this sermon, that were seeking after him. So there's more to it. You have to be willing to take that, to feed on it, to put it into action, to make a life change, and to use it.
Mm-hmm.
You can seek the knowledge all you want, but if you never put it into action, it won't do any good.
Dan points out that you can seek something, but not allow it to actually change you, not allow it to make a difference. People can seek after Christ, but their life isn't changed, which means they don't sincerely seek to learn what his righteousness is. That's the idea, I think, of what you are what you eat. And so if this is something that you earnestly desire, true righteousness, the true wisdom that comes from Christ, well, as you consume that, as you eat that, that is going to be what defines your spiritual nutrition, so to speak. But some people seek it out and then eat the junk food that's sitting right next to it, the stuff that seems adjacent but ultimately is empty calories. I'm going to get very hungry by the end of this. John, do you have something?
Just kind of going along with what Dan said, these folks were following after Jesus, and no doubt they were believing him, but they had to put that belief into practice. They had to be obedient, and perhaps now even today, there's a lot of folks that do believe in Christ and try to follow him, but they haven't completed what they need to do, what Christ indicated what they needed to do to achieve that righteousness, to have the proper relationship, to have fellowship with God. So it's quite a bit of difference, They need that spiritual need, but yet to be able to get that righteousness, they may thirst and hunger for it, but still lacking.
An analogy I just thought of to go with your description is, desperately needing food, smelling this food and coming to the table and then realizing that they're serving you broccoli and just refusing to eat the broccoli. That there's some food that you're not willing to eat despite the intense hunger that you have. Recognize this is life-sustaining. We need to consume it, even if at some points we think, oh, that's not very appealing, I'd rather not. I'd rather have the ice cream instead of the vegetables. I gotta stop making the analogies, though. Do you have something, Jeff? Was there a hand over here? Scott, okay.
Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek. Those are traits that we have to make choices to practice in our lives. Hungering and thirsting for righteousness becomes an autonomic response in our bodies where when we've made these other choices to recognize our sinfulness and our poverty, and to recognize how sad we are about our sins, and to recognize that I will humbly submit to God's will, there needs to become an innate response in us that is not a decision, but it's just it's like an internal drive towards doing, looking for what satisfies. Just like in our hunger and thirsting, that's not a choice. I don't choose to be hungry. I don't choose to feel thirsty. It's an automatic response in my body. And when we make a choice to be humble and poor in spirit and these other things, then the expression of hungering and thirsting for righteousness will come naturally.
Scott points out that with the analogy to hunger and thirst, that's something that should be automatic. That as we become more spiritual, become more in tune with who Christ is, then the desire, the need for righteousness is something that should become an innate response. Steve, I think?
Yeah, these past several comments remind me of Philippians chapter 3, as Paul deals with his own issues. Beginning in verse 8, he says, "But indeed I also count all things for loss, for the excellence of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and count them as rubbish, that I may gain Christ, and be found in him, not having my own righteousness, which is from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness which is from God by faith, that I may know him, and the power of his resurrection, and the fellowship of his suffering, being conformed to his death." So we choose which righteousness we follow, and one leads us to be filled, and the other leads us still sparse.
Steve pointed to Philippians 3, starting in verse 8, and how relying on Christ's righteousness versus relying on my own righteousness, there's a very different outcome. There's a big difference on what is produced from following those things. And the life that we're talking about that comes from pursuing righteousness is not from pursuing my own, from saying that I can be righteous enough on my own, and that's what I should attain to. Let's turn to Psalm chapter 1. I got to throw in at least a few other verses. Psalm chapter 1. "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that brings forth its fruit in its season, whose leaf also shall not wither, and whatever he does shall prosper. The ungodly are not so, but are like the chaff which the wind drives away. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish." First section, the first 3 verses, gives us this analogy. How does it relate? What does this demonstrate? His delight is in the law of the Lord. So he's focused on God and his instruction. He's focused on what God wants him to know, wants him to be. And what is the analogy that's made? What is the picture that's drawn as a result of that? A tree planted by streams of water. It's this tree that is really a picture of lushness. It's flourishing. It's regularly producing fruit. Its leaf is never going to wither. This is a well-sustained, well-supported tree that's living its best life. Whatever he does shall prosper. What's the opposite picture? The ungodly is pictured as what? chaff being blown away by the wind. So as opposed to this strong tree that's vibrant with life, that's producing fruit, producing leaves, growing, we instead have a picture of weeds dried out, desiccated, and just being blown away into dust, of utter disappearing. And he's contrasting those two things, that a sincere focus on godliness, a sincere focus on what God wants me to be, that's life-sustaining. That's this picture of absolute vibrant life. And the alternative is dehydration, desiccation, and death. What does that look like in our lives? What do we see around us? Do we see these two pictures demonstrated? What's it look like? It's a very broad question. Bill? Thanks.
I'd say I'd have to be careful because I'm thinking of Job. He knows the heart of man is at man, of God. So I like blessed is the man who does not go like those goes. That makes me think of blessed is my physical body when I don't eat those hot dogs. But when I only feed it good nutrients, what does that look like? It was healthy and strong and will not waver, and if the storms come, it does not fall.
Bill pointed to, again, the analogy of eating not healthy food versus healthy food. Subsisting on things that aren't good for you physically, that's going to cause pain, that's going to cause suffering, it's going to cause decay. But healthy, vibrant food means you're strong, you endure. And he likened it to some of the other analogies that we've seen in these studies. That's the house that doesn't fall, the house that's not rocked by the storm. It's built on this solid foundation, it's enduring. Let's turn to John chapter 4. Part of picking the passages out for this was just searching the word thirst and finding ones that I thought had a good, strong message that helped fill out this picture. And I think this section especially does that. John chapter 4, let's start in verse 7. A woman of Samaria came and drew water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Then the woman of Samaria said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink for me, a Samaritan woman? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as well as his sons and his livestock?" Jesus answered and said to her, "Whoever drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life." How does this connect to our first passage in Matthew? Or how does it expand that picture? Stephen? So Stephen pointed out the difference between eternal and temporary. That the focus here is on a source of water that's everlasting, that does not fade away, that's always there. And if someone is thirsting after righteousness, and Christ says, "You will receive this fountain that's everlasting," that's being filled. that means you're not thirsty ever again because you have this well that's always there, this fountain constantly producing good, pure, righteous water. Mark, I think?
Similar to, or I guess building on what you're saying there with at the end with the everlasting water, the well that's continuously producing. The picture that comes to my mind with these two verses is the idea that as we're pursuing that righteousness, we know that Christ's physical body had limitations, but we see several examples of the way that he helped with those physical limitations, as well as the spiritual battles that he was fighting while he was here, was to go out and get that fulfillment from the Lord. You have that source, that eternal and everlasting source. It doesn't mean that you're never going to get battered. It doesn't mean that you're never going to get hit, but it means you constantly have something to pull from. And moving back to John's commentary earlier about that exertion, as we go through our day-to-day, as we go through those battles, we are exerting, whether it's physically, whether it's spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, all of the above. You're putting out a lot of effort that goes into those day-to-day things. Where does your refill come from? Because we all have a limited resource when it comes to that in our physical forms. So where is that refilling coming from? Is it something that we have to go out and seek a refill for? Or is it something that we have tapped into that eternal source? And that eternal source will continuously rejuvenate us as we come back to that source.
So Mark pointed out that Christ, while living here on this life, faced times, especially when you're talking about the wilderness, where he was physically hungry, physically thirsty, and going through a lot of trial because of that. But the thing he went back to for his real source of strength was relying on the Lord, relying on the scripture that he had learned, that he knew, that he wrote to. But when we talk about our lives, realize we're going to go through trials too. There's going to be times that are difficult, that are challenging. We're going to face opposition. We're going to face challenges. And what is it we do to replenish? In physical terms, fluids, that's what you do. You replenish after. Gatorade, I think one of their phrases is replenish. But how do you replenish from these spiritual challenges, from these spiritual issues? And if you're scrounging around for bits of righteousness to try to build back up your spirit, that's a lot different than having this fountain right there, always right there to draw on. Nicole, I think? She points out that if we say seek after righteousness, but we don't bother to correct and study the correct understanding of what righteousness is from God's perspective, we can seek after things that we consider good, things that we consider righteous, but if it's not in line with what God calls righteousness, if it's not in line with God's ways, that's going to be not a fruitful way to spend our time. It's not going to lead to the replenishing and the building up that we actually need. John?
Another instance, Jesus talks about where he supplies our spiritual need. He calls himself the bread of life.
All right, I'm going to interrupt John. Let's go to John chapter 6. John chapter 6, verse 32. I don't mean to be rude. That's my next verse. No, you're good. John 6, verse 32. Then Jesus said to them, "Most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." Then they said to him, "Lord, give us this bread always." And Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst." Again, it's powerful imagery that he's bringing forth. How do we take this idea, he who comes to Christ will never hunger, will never thirst, and relate it back to the beatitude? Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. How do those two things exist at the same time? Our faith and trust in God. What do you mean?
The idea of understanding what God is saying that he's going to provide us with. Jesus says the bread of life, that we shall be filled when we hunger and thirst after these things. That's all based on us having the proper faith in God and the proper trust in God that this will actually happen. That's what it means.
So having a proper faith and trust in God and what he's promised, that means that we have to have that, or else the promise of being filled isn't going to happen. The promise of not being thirsty, of not being hungry in these spiritual ways doesn't happen if we're not coming to God in faith. I think, did someone else speak up? Scott?
I didn't understand your question.
That happens sometimes. So the question was, how does this verse, where he says, whoever comes to him shall never hunger, he who believes in me shall never thirst, how does that work alongside the verse that said, blessed are those who hunger and thirst?
I was thinking that our hungering and thirsting is our attitude in response to what our need is, and the fact that he responds by telling us then we will never hunger or thirst. He is promising us to meet our needs at every occasion. And so he says, whatever you need, whatever your hunger or thirst is, I will answer that need and fulfill it. So you will not have a need that goes unanswered by God.
So I think the way to reconcile it, as you said, is that if we're with Christ, if we truly come to him, our need will never go unanswered. The need we have for that righteousness will never be unfulfilled. There is no hunger or no thirst because it's always satisfied immediately by relying on him. So there's one other thing I wanted to look at, and it's a slight deviation. All of these things are very important, recognizing the thirst that we have for God's righteousness to be what's inside my heart, what's inside my soul, what motivates my life, that I need his righteousness to guide the way that I live. There's one other way that I thought about it, and it's because I was in the class dealing with the Old Testament prophets not long ago. Go to Habakkuk really quick. Habakkuk chapter 1. Habakkuk 1, starting the first 4 verses. The burden which the prophet Habakkuk saw. O Lord, how long shall I cry, and you will not hear? Even cry out to you violence, and you will not save. Why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble? For plundering and violence are before me. There is strife and contention arises. Therefore the law is powerless, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, therefore a perverse judgment proceeds. Now Habakkuk, because he was tasked to be a prophet for God, I expect was living a relatively righteous life. I expect that he understood what it was to live righteously before God, to live for God. The description he gives there, to me, sounds similar to thirsting after righteousness, but he's thirsting for it in the world around him. He's saying that wickedness is prevailing. There's wickedness everywhere. Righteousness is not winning in the day-to-day lives of our people in this time and place. God, will you please do something about it? Will you please change this? And the entire book of Habakkuk is a very interesting discussion back and forth. I want to look in chapter 3. His answer at the end. Habakkuk saying in verse 17, though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, though the labor of the olive may fail, and the fields yield no food, though the flock may be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength. He will make my feet like deer's feet, and he will make me walk on the high hills. His earnest desire was to see righteousness in the world around him, to see the wickedness of people around him stopped, to see it put to an end, to see it punished for justice to be done. And he learns that God is going to do justice. He knows that that's going to come. He also knows that it's not going to be a pleasant experience, that it's not going to be a quick experience either. And you see a little bit earlier in that chapter, in verse 16, he's extremely afraid of how those things are going to come to be. And yet his ultimate response is, God is the one who saves me. He's the God of my salvation, even though I just learned that my entire country is going to be near utterly destroyed. He still has that trust in him. And this, I think, in one way, is a picture of thirsting after righteousness, both in himself and for God to deliver that in the world. There's one other passage I want to look at in Psalm chapter 27. And I guess I will just read this passage, and it'll be yours to meditate on for a while. And I think this sort of shows both aspects that I brought up. Him wanting to be righteous, him wanting to live following after God's righteousness, and him trusting that God is going to do righteousness in his life and in the world around him. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When the wicked came against me to eat up my flesh, my enemies and foes, they stumbled and fell. Though an army may encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war may rise against me, in this I will be confident. One thing I have desired of the Lord, that will I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord, and to inquire in his temple. For in the time of trouble he shall hide me in his pavilion. In the secret place of his tabernacle he shall hide me. He shall set me high upon a rock. And now my head shall be lifted up above my enemies all around me. Therefore I will offer sacrifices of joy in his tabernacle. I will sing, yes, I will sing praises to the Lord. Hear, O Lord, when I cry with my voice. Have mercy also upon me and answer me. When you said, seek my face, my heart said to you, your face, Lord, I will seek. Do not hide your face from me. Do not turn your servant away in anger. You have been my help. Do not leave me nor forsake me, O God of my salvation. When my father and my mother forsake me, then the Lord will take care of me. Teach me your way, O Lord, and lead me in a smooth path because of my enemies. Do not deliver me to the will of my adversaries, for false witnesses have arisen against me, and such as breathe out violence. I would have lost heart unless I had believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait on the Lord. Be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord. Thank you all very much for your attention.